have her own husband. But I speak this by permission and not of commandment. For I would that all men were even as myself. But every man hath his proper gift, and of God, one after this manner, and another after that. I say therefore unto the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Okay, so obviously Paul was celibate. He didn't have a wife. And he preferred the men not to marry, to be like him, to be celibate, not to have a wife. Serve the Lord full time, 100%. But he said if you can't contain, you can't help yourself and control yourself, get married. You'd rather be married than to burn. And it's basically goes into marriage and divorce. Don't let them separate. Only if they're dead, if the spouse dies, or of course in the case of fornication. If they do have a spouse die, to try to stay by themselves rather than get remarried. But of course if they can't, then to get remarried. And then of course he goes on down, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou being called a servant, care not for it, but if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's freeman. Likewise also he that is called, being free, is the Lord's servant, is Christ's servant. Ye are bought with a price. Be ye not as the servants of men, but let every man wherein he is called, therein abide with God. Then he goes on down to being married, Christians and virgins, being married and stuff. Some of it's, get into, some of it not. It's, common sense. And honestly, the truth, there's not a lot of virgins in existence anymore. It's hard to really find a woman that's a virgin to marry them that hasn't done anything. That's a rare thing. It's the truth. You look at society today. Then, of course, he goes to marriage and remarriage, more of marriage and relationships. And then he goes on to more of eating food consecrated to a pagan god. Basically saying, you can eat anything now. But, of course, again, there's some believers that don't believe in the certain meats. They're trying to abide by the law in the Old Testament. And, he said to eat with a free conscience, not to go into the temples and eat at the feast for the pagan gods, but you can eat the same food, basically. Because the earth is the Lord's and, the fullness thereof. And he says, but he's saying not to sin against your brethren. He said, but when you sin so against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend. So basically, you got somebody that don't believe this in the Christian faith and in the church, and you got somebody that does. But you want to have respect for your brethren, and you don't want to offend them. Because if you offend your brethren and make them weak and fall out of church because of certain things you push on them that you think's right and you don't agree with them doing, then you're going to offend them. And if you offend them, you offend Christ. So you got to be respectful of your actions. Like me, I chew tobacco. I've done it a long time. Some people don't agree with it. There's one time I chewed and I got jumped on by a bunch of people at a church radio station. I didn't know. But at the same time, if I'd have known that it would have offended them, I wouldn't have done it. But at the same time, if they would have known that I didn't know, they wouldn't have said anything either to offend me, because I didn't know that's what they thought. It's respect for your brethren. Then he goes on and says, if we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? So basically, he's saying we preach for y'all on this, y'all should give us a little bit of change. give us some food. But he said, but we didn't do that. He says, I haven't asked for anything. I preach because that's my calling to do, to you, is to preach. You know, God takes care of what I need. You know, he says, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. So basically, and then he says, unto the Jews I became a Jew. And to the Gentiles I was a Gentile. The weak I was weak. Basically, he put himself into the same level of the people he was preaching to. If there were super Pharisees and all high and mighty and stuff, he would get up there and bring, preach. If they was weak people that was slow to understanding and illiterate, he would speak simply to them. And if it's the Jews that was under the law, of course he would come to them and be on their level. Rather than be above them or beneath them, he'd be on their level so he could reach them. He says, but I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. Okay, so now he's putting his body into subjection. His flesh. He has temptations. And he's got to overcome his flesh as he's preaching. I mean, because if he's going to be a preacher, do all that, and then after he does all, brings all these people to Christ, and he falls out, he'll be a castaway. So he's got to keep his own body in subjection. But, that's for everybody, because if you're making a confession that you're a Christian, and then you're going to go out and do the things that everybody else does, yourself is a castaway. I mean, I've been a castaway. I probably still am a castaway in a lot of people's eyes. But at the same time, it's finding that boundary in your Christian life, being led by the Spirit, and you got a lot of spiritual abuse and people manipulating you and stuff. It's going to mess you up, man. But here in this case, he's got his war is with himself. So how's he got time to judge everybody else if he's trying to keep his own body into subjection? And then he goes on and talks about self-indulgence. Basically goes on down talking about Israel, the past and the Old Testament, and then telling them not to tempt Christ, be idolaters, fornicators, and all that, and not to murmur. He said, there hath no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able. But with the temptation also makes a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. And that way of escape is Christ. You're going to be tempted. You're going to have this come up. You're going to have that come up. Especially if you're trying to do things for the Lord. I have temptations every day. And I have to pray and try to turn. But sometimes I'll be weak and I'll give in. But you got to keep feeding that spiritual man to overcome your temptations and stuff. He's telling them to flee from idolatry. Not to go to the feasts of the idol feast in the city round about, not to participate in that. Because it says you can't drink the cup of the Lord and in the cup of the devils. Not to provoke the Lord to jealousy. He says all things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. What verse is that? Okay. He says, let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth. Check on your brethren. Don't seek your own wealth of being high and having everything all paid for and all this, but check on your brethren. I mean, if you got it, help them out. Not as usury to make them pay you back, but keep each other's backs. Um, then he goes on down. Whatever you eat or drink, glorify the Lord. Give none offense. Don't do anything to offend your brethren or the church. He, of course, tells them to be followers of him as he is of Christ. Now, let me check my minutes. Okay. Now it gets more into the controversial of the women's part in church. A lot of people today use this to rule over their women, to dominate, to be the man, to wear the pants, to be tough, and a lot of people don't believe in women preachers. They don't believe in women prophetesses. If I said it right. They don't believe women should be over the man. But of course, in families and in church, but you look around in society, that's not the case, because a lot of women are by themselves doing it and having to take care of their kids because their men are worthless. And of course, men are stuck with the kids because women are worthless. Of course, being with the same sexes, and it's definitely not the case these days. He said, I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. Okay, wearing a hood or whatever. Now you gotta read, as you read this, you gotta think of the time of society. The women didn't have no rights. Today they vote. Vice presidents, whatever. Congresswomen, mayors, teachers, supervisors, managers. If that's the case, of women not being over the men, you got all these Christians that believe that, but yet they work jobs and the women are their supervisors. He says, but every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head. For that is even all one as if she were shaven. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. This saying, if the woman has her head uncovered, she should cut her hair short or shave her head. And if she don't want to do that, and it's a shame for her to shave her head, then cover her head up. Okay, and it's saying the man not to cover his head because he's the image of God. And man is not of the woman, but the woman's of the man. The man wasn't created for the woman, and the woman was created for the man. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God. Now, Paul says, judge in yourselves. Is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him, but if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. Okay, it's talking about women with long hair. It's glory for her to have long hair, and it's a shame for men to have long hair. Okay, a lot of people use that against men having long hairs, calling them hippies and all that. But then, in the Old Testament, you had the Nazarite. They took a vow to God to have long hair. The priests had long hair. So, he said, he said, judge in yourselves. He didn't say it was for him. He said, judge in yourselves. He was giving them his opinion. Okay, he says, now in this that I declared to you, I praise you not, that ye come together not for the better, but for the worst. Okay. And then, of course, they're eating, doing the Lord's Supper and observance and all that, and they're eating. But then they're being greedy and taking all their food, and the poor people barely get anything. And he's basically telling them to eat in their houses, and if they're going to do all that, don't even come. And then, of course, the communion and stuff, and he's basically saying if you got sin in your life and you do it, you're condemned. You're unworthy, you'll be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. For this cause many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. For if we judge ourselves, we should not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened of the Lord, that we should not be condemned with the world. See, for our works, we are going to be judged for. We will not be condemned, but we're going to be corrected by the Lord. I don't know what that entails, but I know I'm probably going to be chastened because I'm not perfect and I've failed Him so many times. So, I'm just glad I'm not condemned. Now, concerning spiritual gifts, he says not to be ignorant. He says there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are differences of administrations, but of the same Lord. Diversities of operations, but of the same God which worketh in all. Okay, so there's different gifts. So you got all these different denominations. We're all judging each other. But yet God's in all, because, people are calling on the Lord. They believe Jesus died and rose again and is on the right hand side of God. But yet we judge. There's different gifts. Prophecy, apostleship, speaking in tongues, interpreting in tongues, wisdom, knowledge. It says the body is one, but have many members. For by one Spirit are we all baptized into one body, whether it be Jews or Gentiles, or bound or free. We drink of the same Spirit. For the body is not one, but many members. We all have different gifts. If one member suffers, we all suffer. We're all members in particular. And then, we all have different purposes for the glory of God. And then he goes on into charity. Love is everything. And that's what the church has lost, is love. We've forgotten where we came from. It says, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become a sounding brass, or as a tinkling cymbal. He says, charity never faileth, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there shall be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. He says, but now abideth faith, hope, charity. And these three, but the greatest of these is charity. So it don't matter if you're preaching. It don't matter if you have a great faith. It don't matter if you're praying or whatever you're doing, or you're playing music, ministering. If you don't have charity in your heart and that intention, it's void. It's worthless. He says, follow after charity and desire spiritual gifts, but rather that you may prophesy. So now this gets more into speaking in tongues. Because when someone prophesies, it edifies the church because they hear it, they understand. But when you're speaking in tongues, no one understands. And he says if they speak in tongues, to have an interpreter. If not, then to keep silent. For the tongues are assigned to them that don't believe. Because, that's a sign of the power of God. But it edifies their spirit, and of course the Lord. But if, but in the church, it does nothing because no one understands to build their spirit up. Because it's edifying to make you feel good, to worship, to fill your soul up. But, he says to keep silence if there's no interpreter. But, prophecy's better. And preaching's better, rather than that, because, of course, everybody's in the link, rather, in the circle and understanding. Of course, if there's an interpreter, then, speak in tongues, but have somebody say what you're saying, so they'll all get that same filling of the Holy Ghost, and